Okay. All right. So Ashish, I think we're going to start. And yeah, thank you so much for waiting. And thank you very much for coming. I know that today can be very challenging because some lines on the tube are closed, and people like basically transportation in the city is not doing that well. But we are very excited. And so for those of you who are coming to our festival events for the first time, so this is actually part of the events of the Remind Film Festival. And Remind Festival is pretty much a festival on healing. And so the general idea that inspired us to think about this particular festival is a very grim question, really. It's like the world is falling apart. What is to be done? And for us, we actually don't pretend that we have a solution to it. But sometimes the idea is that we all find that the cinema perhaps is a place where we can think about either what can be done to start the healing process, or sometimes we can actually confront with or address the impossibility of it. And so today we are very super excited because I have known Ashish since I studied at Yale, and he was teaching there. And then we were all very excited I really love his work for many years. And then in the past few years, we have been catching up in Rotterdam, like every year. And I've been asking silly questions like in Q&As. And so when I saw Devastated last year, I was really excited about the film. And this year, actually, Ashish has also made a very stunning film. And some of you had taken my seminar might have seen his films before as well. And so this is actually a masterclass with Ashish. And so we have an intimate setting, so we can actually treat it almost as a seminar. Just the format in general, we are also very honored to have Sarah Niazi with us. And so for those of you who are not in the department, Sarah actually teaches South Asian cinema in our department. And so we're very happy to have her here. And so I think Sarah will be asking, has already prepared a lot of questions. And I'm going to facilitate the conversation and occasionally ask a couple of questions. And so we will maintain a conversation with Ashish just among the three of us for about 45 minutes. And then we are going to open the floor to the rest of the seminar. Okay, let's do that. Yeah.
Hey. Thank you so much, Victor, and the festival for inviting me to have this conversation with Ashish and everybody here, particularly because I think I've been, like many of us in this room, perhaps admiring Ashish Avikunthak's work for such a long time, and so this opportunity to sort of have a conversation, a masterclass, is really an honor. I think for many of us, your work has been sort of really interesting, particularly because of its form and the kind of questions that it allows us to think about in a more sort of philosophical and yet at the same time intermediate way. I have prepared a few questions that I'm going to look at my phone for help. So please don't think I'm chatting away on WhatsApp on this. I'm just referring to my notes. So my first question is related to your filmmaking practice and the idea of the cinema of Prayog, which I think you have always been asked about. But I think in this setting with our audience here, it might be really generative to revisit that question. Cinema of Prayoga, for those who don't know, is a term coined by Amrit Gangar. And etymologically, prayoga in Sanskrit refers to a theory of practice. And it emphasizes, I guess, the possibility of thinking about formalistic ways of contemplation, repetition, reiteration, which could be ritualistic, poetic, mystical, aesthetic, mythical, and even perhaps magical to some extent. So Kangar, I think, conceptualizes cinema of prayoga as a kind of distinction or a conversation to what within the West has been thought of as experimental cinema. And for Gangar, the cinema of Prayoga is a kind of powerful critique of the Western hegemonic categorization of experimentation. And to think about Prayoga or practice as a kind of productive, generative possibility of looking at the idiosyncratic, or rather the really complex ways in which Indian avant-garde are looking at film practice, locating deeply their own philosophical thought process in a kind of polyphonic tradition within India. So my question really is if you could sort of explicate your own work and how it might fit into the idea of the cinema of Prayoga as a kind of practice, as a critique, as a philosophical, epistemological challenge to Western hegemonic modes of experimentation. So over to you, Ashish.
First of all, thanks a lot, Victor, for having me. I'm really happy to be part of the festival, both as part of this conversation and the screening that you'll be having later today. So thank you very much, and thank you, the audience, for coming. It's, as Victor said, it seems like a difficult day, which is for communication and traveling, but so thank you for coming. Now, getting directly to the question you've asked. The term cinema of Prayog, when Amrit conceptualized it was in 2006, I think, that he first uses it in a festival called the Experimenter run by Shai Heredia, who had just finished studying at Goldsmith, and she had returned back to India, and she'd started this film festival. I found the term Prayog very useful because I felt it's almost like a refuge, an epistemic refuge, because the term experimental, both the term experimental and avant-garde have such a strong Western epistemic genealogy that I think it totally does a disservice both to what experimental and avant-garde means in the Western framework, and more so to the way the kind of work we are doing. Now, the term Amrit, when he uses the term Prayog, he uses it in the context to begin with. He talks about it in an interview, I think, where he says that when he spoke to Manikal and Kumar Shani, who are like the forebearer of the avant-garde, Indian avant-garde film, they both would get really upset when they were categorized within the term experimental or avant-garde, and mostly because they think that we are not doing what is experimental or avant-garde. Experimental fundamentally is ontologically a problematic term to be used in Indian cinema, because in order for somebody to experiment in the 50s or the 60s or even the 70s in the cinematic form meant you needed to have capital. You needed to have money to make mistakes or to at least experiment. The problem in India was that first, filmmaking was exceptionally expensive. Second, there were all sorts of tariffs and duties over film stock. So you really could not experiment. Even great filmmakers like Satyajit Ray and Ritik Ghotak and other, their shooting ratio was really low. They were sometimes shooting 1:1 or 1:3. Ray, even till the end of his life, was shooting 1:3. So that's like a ridiculously low filmic ratio, mostly because it was expensive to shoot more, and also because film stock and celluloid was very expensive, and they were almost film stock was almost a controlled substance. Not everybody had an easy access to, only big producers had access. So it was impossible to do an experiment in the sense the term experiment is used within the context of Western experimental filmmaking, which, as we know, emerges for the first time in the late 20s, early 30s, within the European avant-garde after the Dadaist and the Surrealist movement. And then later on, it is used in the late 40s and early 50s with filmmakers like Maya Derain and Stan Brakhage and others. So that these two very distinct form of experimental or avant-garde. One has a European origin, another one was American. But in both the cases, the possibility of doing experiment was allowed because it was easy comparatively, mostly because especially in the context of what is called the American experimental or the American underground or the American avant-garde, is that they were basically using amateur cinematic apparatus like 16 millimeter or 8 millimeter cameras, which was not available in India in the 50s and 60s. For instance, it was difficult to get those. So the only film cameras that was available was 35 millimeter, which was very expensive to rent, and the film stock, which was difficult to get. So the historical argument, I would say, which I think Amrit doesn't elaborate in the couple of articles he has written, the historical argument is that it was not technologically feasible to experiment in the 60s and the 70s when the term experimental cinema or the practice of experimental cinema proliferated in Europe and in America because it was so expensive. So that's one of the reasons we really don't have experiment. Even when I started making film in the mid 90s, and I worked on 16 millimeter, which had already become fairly common at that time. Even then, it was very, very expensive to make films. I mean, for example, one of my earliest films I made, I worked at the ratio of 1:1. So there was no way you can experiment. I had to shoot what I had planned very, very carefully. So the possibility of experiment doesn't exist. So I think what happens when Amrit is talking to people like Manikol Kumar Shani, with me, with Amit Datta, and few others, which he is which he has kind of put us in the cinema of Prayog category, the fundamental argument that we were all giving is that we are not experimenting. We know exactly what we are doing. So the term experimental is an epistemic and a technological and an ontological disservice to our practice. And I think Amrit kind of got very attentive to that idea, and he decided to use the term Prayog. Now, the term Prayog, often the criticism of the term Prayog within the Indian world was that the term Prayog is too Hindu. And that became a criticism, and I think that is a very problematic criticism, because the term Prayog is from Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is agnostic. It is religiously agnostic. I think what has happened in the present time is that Sanskrit, the way Hindutva, the right-wing Hindu parties have transformed Hinduism, is that Sanskrit becomes the language of Hinduism, which it was never the case, because Sanskrit was the language of intellectual articulation, not just among Hindus. It was extensively used in Buddhism. It was extensively used in Jainism. So Sanskrit was the language of intellectual articulation, religious articulation at the time of its birth and even later on. So this accusation that Prayog is somehow Hindu is an incorrect assumption. Prayog is a term which, as you have defined, it's a term which is loaded with the theory of practice as at the center. It is how you theorize your practice, which can be experimental. So I would argue that we should use the term cinema of Prayog in the context of what is happening in the Western world, because I think they're also doing Prayog in that sense. So the term Prayog has to be thought. I mean, I think is a much more larger term than just a specific framework. Now, having said that, my practice kind of gets much more dovetails more within the practice of Indian, not just Indian, but specifically tantric epistemology. So I come from a very within the world of Prayog, I'm diving more deeper into a very specific system of thinking, of articulation, of ontological ritual practices, mostly deeply philosophical, almost esoteric. That has been my central way of thinking, and I think of myself more and more as a tantric filmmaker in that sense, if there's a term that one can use. And again, the term tantra is again has to be underscored. It is not associated just with Hinduism. It is religious agnostic. Tantra emerges both within the Hindu, Buddhist, and the Jain context almost simultaneously around the middle of the first millennium, common era. So around between 500 to about 900 CE. It emerges in all the three religious discourses, and then it moves in the upper Himalayas into Ladakh and Tibet, and it is used among the Tibetan Buddhist practices, and it goes eventually by about the 12th century. You see tantric practices or tantric theology or technology is the right word, even as far as Japan, for instance. So I think one has to understand that tantra is just not a Indian centric or a Hindu centric idea. It's a philosophical, ontological, and epistemological concept which is not religiously, let's say, just specific to one religiosity. And that's what I have been. I mean, my own practice I'm trained as an anthropologist. I'm trained as an archaeologist, and so I use these. And so my understanding of Tantra emerges from a very anthropological, archaeological, historical, religious framework, which I then somehow weaving it or transforming it within a cinematic discourse. That is, I think, in a sense, a crux of my practice.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think some very interesting you've said in terms of, your own practice, and I have questions about the philosophical underpinnings of your work. But I want to return back to this question about materiality that you've also gestured towards. Um, because I know, for instance, and you've mentioned this already, the kind of ways in which you work with analog as well as, you're working with digital as well. And so my question is, I guess, about what modes of, film materials do you sort of practice with or experiment with, rather? And I guess this is coming primarily because there is something about analog and the digital that is quite distinct. And more recently, I've been sort of involved with, Harkat in Bombay. They are a studio, as you would know. They're working a lot with reviving analog and sort of doing a lot of very interesting things with the 16 of found footage and things like that. So not only in India, but the world over, we're seeing a sort of kind of leaning back into a kind of revival of analog. Um, and so I think what the analog does is sort of render a kind of textural archival quality to the image, which is again harking back to some ideas about the filmic, surface and its kind of ontological emergence. So I'm wondering like how the digital and the celluloid kind of interact in your films, and if you also think about certain ways of obsolescence of this materiality and what it might sort of um, be generative to think about it in terms of how films get sort of made today in this day and age.
Thank you. So I think I think the material question is central to my practice. I think it's central to most filmmakers' practice. But my own career arc has moved from a world of fully analog cinematic practices in the 90s till the early 2010, when the world was very fixated on the analog, although a lot of filmmakers were seeing its slow demise. And the demise happened very, very quickly. From 2010 to 2015, Fuji stopped manufacturing film, raw stock. Ariflex and Panavision stopped making celluloid camera in 2012. So from 2010 to 2015, and then the third thing is that, which started a little earlier, like around 2009, is when cinema theater moved from 35 millimeter projection to digital projection. So you have these three things, right? The projection moving from analog to digital, uh, film camera, celluloid camera makers deciding that cinema is dead, at least celluloid cinema is dead, so they will not manufacture any 35 or 16 millimeter camera. And the third was the final, I think the death was when Fuji announced that they will stop their celluloid, which I think is also about 2013, 2014. So it was almost by the time when this happened, I had nearly a career of 15 years working within the world of analog. I think, and then the digital really started emerging. Both again, the projection is now, for instance, even if you make a film on 16 millimeter, you have the only possibility to project is digital. There are few places that might offer 16 projector. For example, you know, I think one of the reasons I and Victor became very good friends is because at Yale there was such a strong fixation on showing film on film. So I would end up at the Whitney cinema, the theater there almost every day to watch film on 35. That was such a massive attraction. And now, for instance, between Boston and New York, it's the only place which has a 35 projector between Boston and New York is actually in Yale University. So there was a complete demise. And if, for instance, so what I'm trying to say that even if you want to make a film on 16 today, the only possibility of projection is a DCP projection. It is very rare or almost impossible to have a 35 or a 16 projection. So that is a fundamental shift, which I think is, even if analog is slowly coming back, it is still I don't think so analog will become anything else than a boutique practice. It will not reach a kind of popularity that it existed in the late 20th century. I think that's impossible. It is emerging now as a boutique practice and again, with any boutique practices, it requires a lot of capital. For instance, as a filmmaker who's working with low capital, even now I work with 16 millimeter and digital, but the digital is ridiculously cheap compared to shooting on 16 or 35, right? But the key difference, and this is something I've spoken earlier, is the theory of practice. Both of them have different theory of practice. The final image that is created has certain distinction, but I would say it is totally dependent on the kind of capital you have to impose that distinction. Do I have that much of money? For example, today, if I want to make a feature film shot on 16 millimeter, even in India, feature length film will cost me at least about $70,000 within the way I make, which is already supra low budget. But I can make the same feature film in India on digital for about $25,000, right? So so it depends. So I often think is that, do I make one film on 16 millimeter or three films on digital? And I have over the last 10 years, I've moved towards the latter. I rather make three films on digital than one make film on 16. I'm just finishing a film on 16 millimeter, which I've been working, almost struggling for the last 12 years, mostly because the Indian film infrastructure for the film's infrastructure for celluloid has completely finished. In 2009, when I was still working on when the Bollywood and Indian industry still had celluloid practice, there were about 15 labs in India which would process 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter. Today, there is only Harkat, which does boutique processing. The last proper industrial filmic lab just died 6 months ago. So that there is a crisis. There is a crisis in the world of analog, and this has been happening for the last 20 years, I would say. As from 2005, we've been slowly seeing the demise. So I think there is, and obviously, so why then you still shoot on 16 or on 35? It is only for that texture, hapticness of the celluloid. What I have been doing, and which you will see in With First, for instance, in Devastated, is that we shot the film digitally, but we spent nearly about a month working on the texture. So you will see a lot of grains in the film. They are digitally created, but the idea was to make them as analog as possible. Uh, and so at the end of it totally would depend on you as an audience that how do you interact with that hapticness, digitally constructed analog hapticness, which is what I do. I find I can do within the budgets that I have rather than buy 60 millimeter film and shooting on it. Although, as I said, I'm working on two film, which is on 16, but it is a very slow, very expensive process. I have not yet abandoned it completely. Also, on the other hand, one has to understand there are two separate theory of practice of making the film. Uh, and that theory of practice is highly dependent on capital and technological infrastructure. And I think that is fundamentally the crisis of analog filmmaking today. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's and this reminded me a few years ago, I was in Amsterdam, and I was in a cinema there, and we were sort of invited to watch a film on 35 mm, and we realized very sort of soon into the film that they didn't know. I mean, they had a projector and everything, but they just didn't know how to run it probably. So what happened was that in the middle of it, because it's an old film from the 1980s, it kind of broke, and sort of kind of jigging it into the projector was something they had no idea. And so I understand what you're saying, that kind of, analog infrastructure itself has been sort of becoming obsolete. And so the challenges are even more. And so perhaps analog then becomes more about surface and about what it sort of allows us to feel. But I'm also thinking about how many of us, for instance, are used to the experience of watching analog film, and because we've all now moved to digital, and many of us have grown up only watching digital. And so I'm really looking forward to watching Devastated again today, because I think that that's something that I noticed very much about that texture that you talk about, which I think the film retains. And more, I feel like many filmmakers are able to achieve that texture, that archival quality through the digital, which also I think is a very interesting turn in itself. Um, so coming to a question perhaps about audience, and sort of thinking about the shifting terrains of film culture in India, but also around the world. Particularly in India, we already touched upon how exhibition practices are changing. And there was, at least almost a decade ago, a new momentum because of the presence of, digital and online platforms that were, in abundance. And while I think there was initial excitement about certain kind of revolutionary possibilities, about them being a kind of alternative space for film, particularly avant-garde film or cinema of prayoga kind of practice. Um, but we've seen that these platforms themselves have now replicated more commercial trends of exhibition. So I'm wondering if you see any new potential, or where can we find new potential for independent film and moving image practice in India or around the world, where these alternative audiences could be sort of mobilized and encouraged to sort of come into a film culture that is away from the more commercial mainstream film?
Oh, again, a great question. When the OTT platform emerged, which is around the early 20 teens, right? And about 2015, Netflix and Amazon Prime and other things come in. There is definitely a lot of optimism. But the way they have completely changed and transformed, they make a textbook case of how neoliberal capitalism destroys alternative spaces. It's absolutely a devastation of how neoliberal capitalism completely destroys any kind of alternative system. I remember being on Netflix, and I think Victor would also, like if you wanted to watch DVDs, you went to Netflix, right? And that's how we became first members of Netflix, because we would get free DVDs every day. And then slowly over the decade, we saw how Netflix was instrumental in destroying the very independent cinematic culture of exhibition that it was trying to propagate. And in India, what happened is that there was a lot of hope. But with COVID, we saw very specifically in COVID that mainstream, especially the Bollywood cartel, completely colonized Netflix space. And it was not like Netflix was trying to be something else. Netflix wanted to be huge and big, and that's what happened. Even alternative platforms like Mubi, they came in, and I gave my films to Mubi when it first started in India. But I could not, or I did not renew my contract with them, because I found their practices to be very extractive, in the sense that they were not willing to pay us as much as I think we would. I won't say we deserve, but at least pay something which is minimum and respectful. And so Mubi then becomes, because again, Mubi was also a good example of how neoliberal capitalism totally destroys an alternative space. Is that today Mubi is producing middle of art house cinema for $1 million and stuff like that. And so it seemed like they would be potential for people like us, but it totally, we found, at least I and few others who had, even Amit Datta and I, we both had given our films to Movie with the hope that, okay, this would be a great place that will give us some money so that we can at least we are not expecting profit, but at least we can sustain our practice. But the kind of money Movie was offering us was nowhere near. It almost seemed like a token rather than something that had a certain sustainable possibility. So I think the OTT, the OTT was a dream that totally was went crashing. And today the OTT in India and all over the world has been completely taken over by the same distributive and the production logic and cartel that was there before the OTT came. So it's no different, I would say. And for alternative space, I think for film like the kind of screening we are having here, where there are about a few people who come and watch the film, I think that was the case 60 years ago, when Stan Brakhage and Maya Deren would be showing their films in basements of people's houses, and then getting drunk after that, for instance. I think it's a similar kind of situation even today. Filmmakers like us, especially like me, I think the only reason I'm able to make films is that I am a professor in a university, which is also something very similar to most of the American underground filmmakers or experimental filmmakers were doing in the 60s and the 70s. They would make certain practice and they will end up teaching in art schools and art departments, and because there was no film department then, but most of these filmmakers like Michael Snow, Stan Brakhage, Ernie Gare, everybody ended up teaching in art schools. And the kind of money they got from there, they lived a Spartan existence. Their lifestyle was not very undisciplined, but they lived a disciplined life, saved money, make films, which is what I do. I think the hope of getting money for the kind of films I make, and you will see that with Devastated, nobody in India would fund a film like that. It's impossible. I mean, I even if I go with an idea with that I want to make like one, they will shun me. I mean, funding is the next step. So I think the crisis of alternative cinema, both its production and its exhibition, remains the same as what it was more than 50, 60 years ago. Uh, yeah.
Yeah, I think it is a grim sort of landscape, I guess, but I want to maybe talk more now about your film that we're going to watch and your own sort of perhaps in relation to some of the other films, um, and think about perhaps the more productive ways of thinking of alternate film, uh, particularly, because like you said, you are somebody who is, donning multiple sort of, you know, characteristics. Like you're an anthropologist, you're also a professor. So there's multiple ways in which your practice is imbued with film history, philosophy, and a kind of desire to produce knowledge through a kind of filmic apparatus. Um, and when I think of your films, I see them as a kind of attempt to escape the hegemony of narrative. And so, if we think of your cinema as a sort of a palimpsest, something that has multiple layers, and those layers, there are some things that are more visible, and then there are surface level, and yet there are some that are hidden and underneath, and we need to sort of really engage with those layers by sort of really peeling away at cinematic legibility sometimes, but also kind of, bringing in our own kind of relationship to film viewings practices, cinephilia even. So my question, I guess, is about the way in which you envisage the way in which cinematic experience in your film acts like a conduit for transforming experience, but also perhaps to reverse this question for those of us maybe who think about filmmaking, how would we think about intermediality in the film, where archives and film history, literary tradition, mythology, and also the spiritual, philosophical, discursive tradition can help us build a world. So perhaps to kind of respond to that as a way of knowledge production.
So I don't know if I'm trying to create a knowledge in my cinematic works, but what I'm trying to do in my films, I think this is just, again, this is a hesitant understanding of my own filmic practice. I don't want to be sure of it because then there's no point in making film, right? So it's a hesitant understanding is that what I'm actually trying to do is I'm trying to think through certain ideas that I'm not sure of them myself. I mean, I come, there's this, uh, one of my favorite writers is this Brazilian writer called Clarice Lispector. I don't know if you've heard of her. Clarice Lispector. She's considered to be somebody like James Joyce meets Virginia Woolf, who writes in Portuguese in Brazil in the 19. Her dates are, I mean, her dates are from. She dies in 1970s. So she is like Virginia Woolf, Fernando Pessoa, James Joyce, all wrapped into one. In a sense, a brilliant writer if you ever want to explore.
Sounds like a
So
good
she's
combination.
yeah, she's absolutely stunning. Very few. I mean, I think none in the world does that. So she said something which I really kind of believe. She said, "What's the point of writing something that you've already imagined?" Uh, and I think that's what I'm trying to do in my film, in some films, not all, is that I'm trying to. Therefore, I don't write. I don't write a screenplay. I think what's the point? If you've written the screenplay, then why are you trying to make a film? I mean, then you're just what you're doing is just you're just doing a bureaucratic exercise. You've already imagined something, so then you do a series of bureaucratic processes in order to make that imagine into a cinematic form. What I'm trying to do in my film, at least when I'm trying to make, is that I'm really struggling through certain ideas. And then what you see, and you see a film like Devastated. Devastated was never written in any sense. I had certain ideas. There was Gita in it. There was these bodily practices that I was engaging that you see in the film. Uh, folk is the wrong word, non-Brahmanical bodily practices. And then there was this narrative of the encounter killing, the person who conducts extrajudicial killing. So when I started making the film, I was just struggling with these ideas and trying to see how I can push them together. I shot over the course of 2 years, close to about 15 hours, I think, or probably 12 hours, and then sat down for about a year, another year and a half to edit the film. So editing is really the ontological epistemic practice of constructing the film. So I think of my film as a process through which I am thinking through a problem or an idea that I am fixated with in a certain sense. And in the case of Devastated, uh, Bhagavad Gita, for those who might not be familiar, but if you are coming from an upper class Hindu family in India, that's the go-to text. That's the go-to, let's say, religious slash spiritual slash mystical text, depending on your familial persuasion, right? So I have been reading Gita since I was in junior school, not even high school, because it was proliferated. And Gita is a very, very deeply, massively complicated work. But it is, on the other hand, it is also very highly interpretative. A lot of people have interpreted it in dramatically opposite way. In one hand, we know that Gita was verses from Gita has been interpreted by the Nazis to justify final solution. At the same time, almost exactly the same time, Gandhi is using exactly the same words to to provide a spiritual framework for his nonviolence. So then Gita becomes a very complex text because you can interpret the same verses for justification of violence, complete extermination in the sense of final solution. We know that Hitler had read Gita. We also know that Goebbels, well, not Goebbels, Himmler was basically carrying Gita with him and using it to justify final solution. And around the same time, 1930s, 1920s, 1930s, Bhagavad Gita is extensively used by Gandhi to argue for a nonviolence resistance. So this kind of epistemic ambivalence was something that I still have problems dealing with when I read a text like Gita. And not just Gita, this kind of epistemic ambivalences of interpretation is also seen, is actually, I would argue, is the crux of many of Indian religious texts. And I think there are reasons for such ambivalence, but that would be that would be another conversation. But the important thing is to notice that there are ambivalent text, which allows for multiple, almost opposite interpretative possibilities. And this was a big, what should I say, philosophical crisis for me. And I think this is what I'm trying to do in this film. I'm trying to kind of grapple with the crisis. I don't have an answer. So what you see in most of my filmic praxis, a filmic praxis is a way of grappling with issues that I don't have good answers about. So Gita becomes one element in this film. The second element, as you know, is the encounter killing. Now, encounter killing in India has a very long history. We have encounter killing is the term, for those of you who don't know, for extrajudicial killing in India, where people are killed because they are thought by the state as somebody who has to be eliminated without due process. Now, due process, as we know, has become very important nowadays in the context of the immigration problem that we see in America, is that people are arguing is that you have to give every individual has a due process before they are either eliminated, killed by the state, or removed. Due process is the key to a democratic, liberal democratic way of thinking. And I think, and so what happens with extrajudicial killing is that due process is not given. People are eliminated because they are thought not important for various political reasons. And we see that for the first time in India, extensive and overt usage of extrajudicial killing happens in Calcutta, the city that I'm speaking from right now, a city which is my home, in 1969, 1970, when we have in Bengal, in Calcutta, the rise of Naxalites, which were Maoist-leaning, extreme left, violent groups, let's put it this way. And they were eliminated by the Indian state, by the West Bengal state, in the almost for the first, from 1969 to 1975, 74, such killing was very commonplace in Bengal, especially in Calcutta. And then there was you do not see that being used by the state in so extensively. The second incident in which such extensive usage of extrajudicial or encounter killing happened in India, it was during the Punjab insurgency in the late 1980s and early 1990s, where again that we know from journalistic record, again, we don't have any much academic work. There's a lot of academic work on the Naxalite, but there's not much on what happens in Punjab, because it is, I think, still a simmering crisis, is that close to about 10,000 people disappeared or were eliminated during the insurgency in the late 80s and early 90s. And then the third big moment is the moment that happens in Maharashtra, in Bombay, in the mid-90s, which happens to be the time when I'm also there in Bombay. The first right-wing government in Maharashtra comes in. The right-wing government is called Shiv Sena, a political extreme right party. And they conduct extensive encounter killings from 1995 till about early 2000. The killings were done to eliminate basically gangsters, and of which so this was a response to, again, if response by the state, by the Hindu right-wing state, to eliminate Muslim gangsters who were involved in the bombing in Bombay in 1993. So it has that. And before that, you had the 92 Bombay riots. Before that, you had the Babri Masjid. So it's all interconnected. So I was in Bombay when Babri Masjid was destroyed in 1992, and I was there in Bombay during the 1992-1993 Bombay riots, which was one of the most bloody and uh, one of the most bloodiest riots in India after 1947, in a city like Bombay. And I was there in the city and I saw the riots more closely than anybody who is 20-year-old should see, I would think. I worked as a political activist then. I was working as a relief activist. So I saw the riots very closely. Then a year later, when the Bombay blast happened, I missed the blast by about 3 minutes. And then in 1995, when the Shiv Sena government came in, I saw, I mean, I would read encounter killings were happening very extensively. I had friends who were lawyers with whom I worked, not really worked a lot, but I knew them, who were basically representing the families of Muslim men and women, mostly Muslim men who were assassinated by the state. So I saw that Bombay encounter killing again very closely. By early 2000, encounter killing has now become almost like a statist tactics to eliminate anybody they don't like. It's now, what should I say? It has become ubiquitous in a certain sense. That it is so ubiquitous that we don't even hear of them in newspaper reports anymore. Such killing has become so commonplace. So when I start, so again, so you have these two crises I'm dealing with, Gita and this kind of political violence. So what I am trying to do in this film is trying to grapple with these two issues. And I think there is a productive conversation that is happening in uh, these two moments in this film, and which is what I'm trying to do. And I don't have a good answer. This film is not about providing any answers. I actually don't. I still don't. But I think this is a way of. So therefore, the reason I don't think so I have answer, I don't think so I'm producing a knowledge as such. I think there's an epistemic confusion I'm dealing with, a certain degree of ambivalences, and that's where the film ends. With it's something that I'm still thinking through. I might make another film dealing with the same issues. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we're also thinking with you on this because I think there's a very interesting way in which, the banality of evil and the kind of violence that exists in India today is very much in conversation in the film. I mean, you're sitting in Calcutta and we've recently had the elections in
BJP has
Bengal
come
and
through.
Assam, and BJP has had a very kind of reemergence, has won the elections. And of course, there's a kind of very interesting rhetoric that's kind of, but I don't want to get into it too much. I want
That's
to
okay.
give opportunity to Victor to maybe ask a few questions and to the audience here.
I think if anything, I may have one question. I mean, I have so many questions I would like to ask you, but I think as this question, it's actually connected to what Sarah has just asked, because I've also read some of your interviews, and also like sometimes you were being asked, the idea is that a very Asia as method question, because the idea is that some interviewers, I've seen interviewers asking you, do you intend to, for example, create a specifically, like a kind of cinema that is specific to Indian tradition or contemporary India? But this question, as we kind of in our exchanges in Rotterdam, I also remember that there is no pure such thing as pure in the Indian tradition, and the idea is that everything we now know that we inherit is always filtered through colonialism, post-colonialism, and nationalism that is built upon colonialism. So in some ways, I would like to hear from you a little bit more about this Asia's method question, the idea, in some ways, almost Spivak would call the representational question. Yeah.
Again, a brilliant question, Victor. So as you mentioned, I think the very fact that we are speaking in English itself is an evidence of why Asia as a method or India as a method will not work, I would say. The very fact that we're engaging with the language which is outside of Asia, for that matter, or India. Having said that, I think what I am trying to do is that it's a very nuanced kind of work I'm trying to do. We cannot escape modernity. That's given, right? The very fact that I'm speaking to you in English, the very fact that I'm on this kind of a technological apparatus. So we are deeply, deeply, deeply rooted within modernity, technological modernity, post-colonial modernity, and so many kinds of modernity, right? And I think we can't escape that. And I'm not even trying to escape that. The very fact that I'm making a film, I'm making cinema. I'm deeply rooted in capitalism, neoliberal capitalism. The very fact that I'm using a Mac to a Macintosh, Apple laptop, and I think the software that we are using is a Microsoft software. So I think even to critique neoliberal, late capitalistic corporatization would be does it would do a disservice to how we are thinking. So I think it's very clear that for me, I do not have any such what should I say? I don't have any such imagination that we're trying to do something revolutionary. I think revolution is not possible within. You can't have a revolution using Instagram, Microsoft, Apple laptops, Sony cameras, and things like that. It's that you can't do that. You can't challenge. But therefore, having said that, my argument, my answer is that we are deeply rooted in modernity, neoliberal modernity, technological modernity. What I am trying to do is that within that framework, is it possible to highlight a non-Western epistemic framework, which it's just a highlight. Let's say, if to put it in a very blunt way, 98% is already modern. I'm trying to work with the 2%, right? It's just the two. Is that a possibility? And I think I would argue that I think there is something about the 2% that makes it really formidable. That's where Asia as a method becomes important. That's where India as a method becomes important. Is that I think it's the only thing that we can uh, hold on to is that 2% of philosophical epistemic, let's say, conduit to a non-Western pre-modern possibility, right? I think it's a very, very minute thing that we are trying to do, because the rest of it is already it's too there's no way out, as I explained, right? So I think, and so therefore what happens is that when you think of term cinema of Prayog, for instance, the Prayog is just that small 2%, right? It's already cinema, it's already modern. It's just that small thing we are trying to work, something not just small, very minute. It's a very nuanced gesture that I think I have been spending the last 30 years working on in cinema. Again, on the other hand, within the world of film theory, for instance, and this is something, Victor, you have been doing, is that I think your scholarly work, my thinking is that within the world of film theory, which is so heavily dependent on Western epistemic theoretical framework, what we are trying to do is that that there is a possibility of thinking of the modern from a non-Western epistemic framework. I think that is what we are trying to do, is that over the years, over the last 2 centuries, modern epistemic framework has been the only way to engage with Asia. I think what we are trying to do, and that's why I really, really enjoy reading your work, is that I think the argument is that there's a very robust Asian, Indian, Buddhist, Chinese, Hindu, Sufi, Islamic, epistemic, philosophical tradition that can provide new insights of what it means to be a flawed modern subject. And I think that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you so much. I'm aware that, let's see if we have questions from our audience. Yes, please.
Hello, Ashish, and thank you very much for the talk today and all your very beautiful films. I'm a very big fan of your work as a fellow filmmaker. My question for you today is about your positionality in relation to your filmmaking practice. I'm curious to know, as a diasporic individual yourself, you have been spending time in the US and also back home in India, like you are now, which I think we're quite glad to know. um, how do you see your relationship to your supposed homeland? And maybe that can be informed by your changing relationship to your host country over time, and how your positionality as such um, informs or changes or shifts your filming practice in terms of, for example, how you approach your filmmaking, how you distribute your work, and how you choose the topics to explore. Please share with us. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for that question. Uh, so I think of myself living in two homelands, so as to say, is that uh, I am my positionality is fragmented. It is not a singular positionality. I'm not sure if I am a fully diasporic subject also. Neither do I think I'm a fully national subject. Neither I think I'm a fully international subject. I'm like it's a fragmentary existence, and that has been the core of my subjectivity for the last 27 years. I moved to the US in 1999 as a graduate student, and I have been there since then. But I've also never left India because I spend nearly 5 to 6 months in India every year. So I go back and forth constantly. I've been doing that for the last 30 years. The amount of money I've spent flying back and forth between India and the US, I think I would have made another 6 films. It's that so, but that's the key. That's one of the that I've spent a lot of money going back and forth, for instance. So therefore, I think of myself as a very fragmentary person, and the very fact that I'm speaking to you in English, but I'm actually thinking in Hindi. But I live in Calcutta, which is a Bengali. It is big. It's a which is the language is Bengali. So I make films in Bengali. I'm a Hindi speaker, but I'm most articulate in English. So it's just a whole bunch of different kind of fragments, and I'm not I'm happy to be such I don't think of myself as hybrid in the way Bhabha would think. I think of myself more as a very fragmentary subject. So for example, I write in Hindi also, I write in English also, I make films in Bangla. So the three linguistic registers are constantly, let's say, working in my head. So when I think of what kind, but there is a clarity I have is that I'm very clear that my films are located in India, that they deal with Indian philosophical, epistemic, political, theological ideas. I don't think so. I am interested in intervening in the American cinematic space. But I teach in America. For me, teaching in America is a way of procuring capital, if that makes sense. Because Indian academic sphere would not allow a filmmaker like me to exist. For instance, I can't show my films in India. A film that you'll be watching today with Vast uh, cannot be shown in India at all. Uh, so so the distribution question is that I really don't work very hard distributing my films. I think I have decided, because distribution is, for instance, is a very specialized, highly time-consuming work to do. It's and I either I make films or I distribute them. So I have decided that I rather make films. So I have spent all my energy of working and making and thinking in the possibility of making films. Yeah, distribution. If Victor said, "Oh, I'm doing something. Would you be interested?" I said, "Yeah, why not?" I also don't send my films to many festivals. There are a couple of festivals where I know there are people who would be open to the kind of uh, theoretical thinking am I doing. Rotterdam is a great place. Rotterdam International Film Festival, Rotterdam, has been showing my film for about, have shown 5, 6 of my films, and I find it to be a very open space compared to other festivals, which there aren't any space. And then within the world of film festival, there's another thing that has come up, which I get a little annoyed with, is that if you start the submission fee to the film festivals are often enormous, and uh, so yeah, I don't really think of the distribution question much. I make films, and I hope people like Victor and others like you guys would come and watch it, which is fine. I mean, I enjoy making films. I think I like making films. I'm driven by the idea of making films. I'm also happy to show them, but I'm not driven by the idea of spending time distributing them. Thank you
Do
for
we
your
have
question.
another? Do we have another question? Anyone? Hi, Ashish. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk. I'm looking forward to watching Devastated again tonight on the big screen. You spoke earlier very eloquently about the texture of the image in the film, and I wanted to ask you about the editing of the film, because when I first watched it, I was quite stricken by the way that you used cutting to associate different images together. And yep, I was wondering if you had any insights on that.
So this film is an editing film. There's nothing else in the film. I think, I did spend a lot of time shooting and all that, but even my practice is such that I can tell you how we make the film, how we made this film, is that I had Gita. So the Gita section, I was very clear, because Gita is a very, very large book. Uh, so I had to look at a very specific section. And the specific section, now that you asked me, I should tell you, uh, is based on a critique of Gandhi by Dr. Ambedkar on these specific verses. So Dr. Ambedkar, who was the leader of the Dalits in India, and he was a bitter critique of Gandhi and Gandhi's nonviolence. And so he wrote an essay which is not exactly dated. Even in his completed work, we don't know the exact date, but probably sometime in 1929 or 1931, between that time, where he picks up exactly these verses that you see, the 28 verses of chapter 2 that I use in the film, where he argues that these verses are verses that justifies violence in India, in Hinduism, against the Dalits. And he also talks about that Gandhi's idea of nonviolence completely is fake, because the very text that he uses argues for violence. Again, as I said earlier, Gita is prone to multiple interpretation. So what I did in the film, I knew that these are the verses I wanted to work with. And then I knew that I then wrote these conversation between the encounter specialist and the female protagonist, which at time is his wife, another time is his non-wife. I don't know what she is, but she's not the wife. So it's the wife and the non-wife that they play around with. And I wrote a bunch of these dialogues. I wrote at least, I think I must have written about some 30, 40 pages of it. What you see in the film is just about the first 25 of them. So there's another 15 that we did not use. And usually I write in English. and Hindi. So I wrote these dialogues in English. Then I worked with my collaborator, a long-time collaborator who writes in Bangla. So we worked together, and he's worked with me for nearly for the last 20 years. We've been working together. He's a poet, and so we work together to get the Bengali versions. And then I work with actors who are mostly what you see in the film are actors who are not professional actors in the sense that they don't work in the industry. They are basically working in the theater world in Calcutta, in almost the amateur theater world in Calcutta, who also have their day jobs and they also do theater work. So I work with them. So most of these actors are non-actors in that sense. And then what we did is that we start shooting again, because I moved between India and the US, so I shoot during the summer months and in the winter break when I come. I think I shot this over the course of about a year and a half, I think, 2016 to 2018. And then I sit down with all the footage with my editor. So what the editor does, and in this case, it's a woman editor. So what she did is that she put all the footage together and constructed something that she wanted. Again, we don't have a script, so I gave her the freedom to edit whichever way she likes. And then once she has done the work, it comes to me. And then I spent about a year and a half trying to play around, moving back and forth. And so the editing is the crux of the narrative that you see. And then in this film, we deliberately use violent editing, like very specific cut back and forth. And this is something that is very carefully used in the film. Thank you.
And would you mind sharing with us how come this film, Devastated, is now permitted to be shown in India?
Sure. India has a very strong, very conservative censorship regime. So in order for public exhibition of any film, it needs to go through what's called the board of certification. There are board of certification in almost all the countries in the world, like in UK or in US. But these are board of certification that would certify the film, that this film is not meant for children or this film is not meant for teenagers and so on and so forth. So it's like the certification in the West usually works as a warning, as a trigger warning that this film is not meant for children, right? In India, we don't have such certification. We have certification which clearly will decide, the censor certification board will decide that this scene doesn't work. It needs to go out. This language doesn't work. This word doesn't work. So almost they become part of the script unit, so as to say. They will decide the cuts, they will decide the language and so on and so forth. So this film, because of its political content, because of its religious content, if I go to the censor board, they will throw the whole film out. I have been to censor board for my first feature film, which they told me that there's a scene in that feature film where the main two protagonists are in the fish market. It's an open fish market, and they are watching a chicken being cut so that they can take it at home to eat. The censor board decided that this was too violent, and they decided that they will only let me release the film publicly if I can remove that sequence. I refused to do that, so the film was never released, and it is still not released. Subsequently, I have not gone to the censor board because I have realized that if I go and show Vidvas, they will probably delete the whole film. So that's the reason it cannot be shown in India, because of very strict censorship practice.
Any other questions?
I'm just wondering, since you spoke about the censor board and not if you had gone to someone in India for funding, it wouldn't have worked out. Do you find it more liberating in your practice while you're editing or making the film, knowing that India is not going to be the audience of your film?
I think that's a great question. I really don't think of the audience irrespective. For me, I mean, I think in that sense, you would not ask this question to a painter. You don't ask a question to the painter, who's your audience? The painter paints. You would also not ask this question to a poet. The poet writes. So I work within that logic. I really don't think of the audience. But on the other hand, you're right. If in India, most filmmakers, even before they imagine the film, they have been censored by the state. So all the big films, and this is just not commercial film. I would argue that filmmakers like Satyajit Ray and Ritik Ghotok, the great Indian filmmakers, they were already, the censorship practice of the state is already part of their unconsciousness. So even as a filmmaker, the kind of story they're choosing are stories which they know will not have a censor problem. So what has happened with the censorship regime, which started in India in 1921, that it has become so deeply ingrained that it is part of the Indian cinematic consciousness, or let's say subconsciousness. That if you're an Indian filmmaker and you want to make a film, you are already aware that you can't have nudity, you can't have this kind of politics, you can't have this kind of language. So your creative process is already deeply subverted. So I would argue that the artistic intentionality that is there in a cinematic form is already subverted for all Indian filmmakers. Uh, and and what so I find it liberating because I don't think of censor code, so I can do anything that I want to show. And that's what I've been doing for the last 30 years of my filmmaking practice. Like, for example, my first ever film was a man walking nude in a desert. Uh, Nobody would show it. This was 1995.
Yeah, actually, speaking of, because Sarah and I had a little discussion about nudity, and because last time in Rotterdam, I remember that we were sitting in the metro, and I was sitting right next to your actress who has been in many of your films. And she actually talked to me about nudity, like performing nude in your films. And she basically said that she has always felt really comfortable and very confident with your way of handling the nude human body. And so indeed, the idea is that for us, yeah, sometimes it could be about eroticism, but it is not about, oh, like erotic. It's really about the texture of the erotic. Sometimes it's about the pure body, and sometimes it's about the pure texture and also the palimpsest, as Sarah would say. So, and yeah, so we'd like to hear a little bit from you about your use of nudity, especially since we have already touched upon like censorship, palimpsest, and yeah, and also sexuality and gender as well.
So one of the things that I tried doing with the nude body, uh, there are two fundamental things I'm trying to do. First, the nude body within Indian representation tradition, especially the Indian iconographic tradition, the nude body is not the sexed body ever. Within the Buddhist tradition, within the Jain tradition, within the Hindu tradition, either the male nude, especially in Jainism, with the genitalia being completely obvious, the female nude in Indian Hindu tradition. The nude body is never the sex body. It is neither the erotic body, it is neither the sensual body. All the scholars have argued for erotic body in Indian iconographic tradition. Some scholars have even argued for the sensual body. I would critique them. I think the nude body within the Indian iconographic and the representational tradition is at best a banal body, and at its most exquisite is the enlightened body. So nudity is a very clear reference to purity, religious purity, emotional purity. It's the epitome of the pure ontological status of of the object that has been represented, right? You also have, for instance, when I mean by the object represented, it is just not divine figures. You also have royal figures. You also have working class figures within the Indian iconographic tradition who are depicted nude. These are not erotic, sensual bodies. They represent a certain degree of purity in them. So that's my theory where I come from. Even, for example, in Vidvas, you would see the two actresses kissing. I think it is not erotic at all. It is there's certain something else happening. What the second thing that I try to do in my film is that I am often, and I think the nude body within the history of cinema is always the sexed body. It's always the erotic body. Nude body means they have certain sexual interaction or they have an erotic interaction. And again, within the history of pornography, it's exactly the history of pornography is only about that interaction of the nude body, right? Nude body means the sex body. So what I'm trying to do in my film is critiquing that, is that the nude body in my film is everything else but the sex body. At best, it might be the banal body, and at sometimes in a film like Dispassionate Love, I think the nude body is the divine body. Yeah.
Do you have more questions, or yeah?
About, I mean, which you've a little bit touched upon, because we're talking about perhaps to reflect a little bit upon, the sacred and the profane in your films, and particularly we're going to be watching Devastated soon, and perhaps maybe reflect a little bit also on rituals and prayers and mantras that are in the film. And you mentioned they are kind of like conduits, I would say, to access philosophical, and as well as dialectical encounters between the sacred and the profane. And so I want to sort of hear about the process of including some of the rituals in the the slaughter, the offering to Kali, and how these sort of intervene to some extent into existing discursive traditions about rituals, and also how might they puncture the hegemonic right-wing Hindutva reading of these practices. So those kind of, I guess, tenuous and complex relationships.
So one of the things that I have been doing, well, let's say, the fundamental theory of practice of my filmic oeuvre is challenging the Hindutva imagination or the Hindutva theory of India. Fundamentally, I would say. My argument is this, is that Hinduism is slowly being morphed into Hindutva, that Hinduism means Hindutva. This, I think, is a massive problem for a practicing Hindu like me, because I don't think Hindutva is Hinduism at all. As a matter of fact, Hindutva, I would argue, is a corrupted, adulterated fragment of the worst part of what Hinduism has. In the same way, and it's not a good analogy, but in the same way as what ISIS is to Islam, right? These are aberrations, and I think Hindutva is such for Hinduism. What I am trying to do in my cinematic practice is to challenge that by foregrounding the tantric, by foregrounding the ritual, and by suggesting, and sometimes unambiguously, that these practices are the key to our understanding of religiosity. So therefore, I use the oral mantric tradition, or I use the ritual tradition, different kind of ritual, is to kind of foreground unambiguously what the Hindu form is. And here I'm not talking in terms of like Indian religiosity. I'm very speaking about Hindu religiosity, or what we understand as Hindu religiosity in contemporary times. And this is something that I do. I'm trying to challenge Hindutva, and this is and within my small, within this highly censored way. I know my works will not be distributed. It won't be go on the world, but I think what I'm just trying to do is just to make them. I think for me, making itself becomes a political act. And what I have been doing in a lot of my films is that I would argue that every act has a ritual ontology, right? Even the very fact that you get up in the morning, brush your teeth, do your morning ablution, that's a ritual activity. It doesn't have any religious undertone, but it can easily become religious, right? For instance, you would not you would not enter a public space, a public sphere without properly cleaning yourself and properly wearing the right clothes, right? So those are also rituals. So I think the ritualness is the key to our human existence as both a private person, an intimate person, and a public person, right? So it is and this is the anthropologist in me speaking, is that ritual then becomes the daily act of being human. And this then gets colored or colonized by religious discourses, which is what we see all over the world. I mean, this is me as an anthropologist speaking. And so what I do, for example, in this film, you see a lot of bodily acts and the film ends with these men rolling over fire. Those are both ritual and religious act at the same time. It's the act of rolling over fire is both intimate and public. Public because everybody can see it, intimate because it's really hurting the person who's his skin is actually getting burnt. And in this intimate and public dialectics, this religiosity emerges, right? And we see that, for example, in Islam, in Shia Islam, the Muharram, where men are flagellating themselves with sharp objects. I mean, I've shot a lot of Muharrams in Calcutta, in Lucknow, where the amount of blood that is shed on the street makes the street red. But there's what happens, and so this is again not just Hindu. I'm saying it also happens in Islam, for instance. I haven't seen such self-flagellation, such let's say, bodily act in Buddhism, for instance, or Jainism. But Jainism, on the other hand, another thing is where men are naked and they walk in the streets. The Digambar Jains do this other act, which is of a different kind of violence or non-violence, as you want to say. So I'm very interested I'm very interested in these moments of the dialectic between the public and the private, the public performance and the private or the intimate act of hurting yourself. I think in that something emerges, which in this film also kind of has a conversation with Gita and the encounter specialist, because the encounter killing is both a public and a private act at the same time, right? So I'm thinking about again, I don't have really good answers. It's just that I'm just trying to grapple with certain of these ideas. And I do that in almost all my films, this ambivalent moments of meaning making and a certain kind of, I won't call it dialectical, but certain kind of dialectical form that I'm working with.
So I am aware of the time, and I also know that it's starting to get later and later in
Yeah,
Calcutta.
it's about 9 o'clock right now. Yeah.
So, Ashish, like I always find that like speaking to you in private or in public, it's always very inspiring, always very pleasurable, and I've always learned a lot from you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
so, thank you very much, first of all, to allow us to see this film this evening, and to spend so much time to talk to us and to share your thoughts with us. And we're really, really grateful. Yeah.
Thank you.
So-
Thank you for having me, Victor. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate this.
Thank you. So let's actually give, Ashish a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashish. And so also thank you, Sarah, for asking so many inspiring questions. And thank you, all those of you who have asked questions. So Ashish, as I said earlier, hopefully in the next couple of years, we would have enough money. We would do all we can to fly you over to London so that you can actually
I will
talk
be
to us in
very,
person.
very happy to do that. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Thank you again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so
And I'll
much.
send you my introductory video to the film in about half an hour.
Thank you. All right. Okay.
care.
Have a good night.
Be well.
Okay. Thank you.